I wasn't ignored. I was still included, still there, still beside them, but somehow I had stopped being felt. We didn't fight. Nothing was obviously wrong. This is the story of the day I finally said something and learned what silence had been trying to tell me all along. I finally said something. After holding it in for so long, after swallowing the words every time they rose to my throat, after convincing myself that silence was easier than explaining how I felt, I thought saying it out loud would finally make it real. I thought once the words existed in the air between us, they wouldn't be able to ignore them anymore. For a long time, I told myself I didn't need much. I wasn't asking for grand gestures. I wasn't asking to be saved. I just wanted to feel seen. And I believed that if I could say it the right way, calmly, gently, without blame, something would finally change. But before I said anything, there were years of quiet I need to explain. Because from the outside, nothing was wrong. We didn't fight. We didn't scream at each other. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic breakups, no betrayals to point to. If someone asked how we were doing, I would have said, "We're fine." And in a way, that was the problem. We were fine in the way a room can be tidy but empty. Everything in its place, but no warmth. They were there, physically present, sitting next to me on the couch, sleeping beside me at night. But slowly, I learned what it felt like to be alone with someone. It started with small things, conversations that didn't go anywhere. I would begin a sentence and watch their attention drift before I finished. Messages I sent that stayed unread just a little too long. Not because they were busy, just because responding wasn't urgent. Moments when something important happened in my life, and I realized hours later that I hadn't told them yet. Not because I forgot, but because some part of me already knew it wouldn't land. I stopped reaching for them without realizing I had. When you're emotionally neglected, it doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, like a dimmer switch being turned down one notch at a time. You don't wake up one day and think, "I feel invisible." Instead, you think, "Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe this is just what long relationships look like." So you adapt. You stop expecting check-ins. You stop sharing the small details of your day. You tell yourself you don't need reassurance. You learn how to carry things alone, even while someone is walking right beside you. There were nights I sat next to them, scrolling on my phone, not because I was distracted, but because it was easier than feeling ignored in silence. There were times I wanted to say, "Can you just ask me how I am?" But I didn't, because asking felt like begging, and I didn't want love that had to be begged for, so I stayed quiet. I stayed understanding. I stayed patient. I told myself they showed love differently, and for a long time I convinced myself that this was enough, until it wasn't. The moment I realized something was breaking inside me wasn't during a fight. It was during a completely ordinary day. I remember sitting there, listening to them talk about something that mattered deeply to them. I nodded. I asked questions. I stayed engaged. And when they finished, they didn't ask me anything back. They just moved on. And I felt this strange, hollow drop in my chest. Not anger, not sadness. Just the quiet realization that I had disappeared from the center of my own relationship. That was when I knew I couldn't keep doing this in silence. Before I spoke, there were nights when I lay awake next to them, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that this feeling wasn't real. I would replay the day in my head, searching for proof that I was wrong. Proof that they cared more than I felt. Proof that I was just imagining the distance. I told myself that love changes over time, that passion fades, that expecting emotional closeness was unrealistic. I compared who I was then to who I had been at the beginning. I remembered how easily I used to talk, how quickly I used to laugh, how natural it felt to be myself. And I noticed how careful I had become. Careful with my words. Careful with my moods. Careful not to ask for too much. I wasn't asking for constant attention. I wasn't asking to be someone's whole world. I was asking to exist in it. There were moments I almost spoke up sooner, but each time I talked myself out of it. I told myself it wasn't the right time, that they were stressed, that I should be more patient. Silence felt safer than risking disappointment, but every time I chose silence, something inside me felt a little less solid, and eventually I realized that not speaking was costing me more than speaking ever could. So I prepared myself to speak. I rehearsed the words in my head, not dramatically, not emotionally. I didn't want to accuse. I didn't want to overwhelm them. I just wanted to be honest. When I finally said something, I did it calmly. No tears, no raised voice. I said it on an ordinary day, in an ordinary moment, because I didn't want it to feel like an attack. I told them I felt alone sometimes, even when we were together. I told them I didn't need more effort, I needed presence. I said, I don't need you to fix me. I just want to feel like I matter to you. They listened. At least, it looked like they did. They didn't interrupt. They nodded. They said the right things. I didn't know you felt this way. I'm sorry. I'll try to do better. And for a brief moment, I felt relief. Not because everything was solved, but because I had finally been brave enough to say it. I thought, now they know. Now things can change. For a little while, it seemed like they might. They checked in more. They asked how my day was. They remembered small things again. And I held onto those moments tightly, like proof that speaking up had worked. But emotional neglect doesn't disappear because it's acknowledged once. Slowly, the old patterns returned. The conversations shortened again. The check-ins faded. The space between us quietly reopened. Not out of cruelty, not out of malice, just out of habit. And that's when something painful settled in. They hadn't ignored me because they didn't understand. They hadn't missed my needs because I hadn't explained them well enough. They understood. They just didn't change. After that realization, my mind kept returning to the conversation we had. I replayed it again and again, wondering if I could have said it differently. Maybe if I had used softer words. Maybe if I had explained it more clearly. Maybe if I had chosen a better moment. I rewrote the conversation in my head dozens of times. In every version, I was calmer, more precise, more reasonable, as if pain needed perfect grammar to be taken seriously. That's when I understood something exhausting. I wasn't lacking words. I was carrying the responsibility of making my pain easy to accept. I was translating my loneliness into sentences that wouldn't inconvenience them. And the truth was, no amount of clarity could create care where there wasn't enough priority. They didn't change, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't have to. And that realization didn't make me angry. It made me tired. Tired of performing emotional clarity. Tired of waiting for empathy to arrive later. Tired of hoping effort would follow understanding. I stopped trying to explain myself better. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I finally saw that saying it again wouldn't bring me closer to being chosen. And that realization hurts in a very specific way. Because you stop blaming yourself. You stop wondering if you asked for too much, or said it wrong, or waited too long. You realize that sometimes love isn't absent because of misunderstanding. It's absent because of priority. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Tired of explaining my feelings like they were a language I had to translate perfectly to be worthy of care. Tired of hoping that this time would be different. Tired of shrinking myself to keep the peace. I noticed how quiet I had become again. Not because I was afraid to speak, but because some part of me knew it wouldn't matter. That was the moment everything changed inside me. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just a quiet shift. I stopped waiting for them to notice. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped hoping that love would arrive if I was patient enough. I realized something important. Saying something didn't change them, but it changed me. It showed me that love shouldn't feel like a performance review where you carefully list your needs and wait to see if they'll be approved. It taught me that being heard isn't the same as being held, and that being understood means nothing if it doesn't lead to care. I don't know exactly when I stopped feeling invisible. I just know that once I saw the neglect clearly, I couldn't unsee it, and I couldn't keep living inside it. Some relationships don't end with a fight. They don't end with a clear goodbye. They end with a quiet knowing. The kind that tells you that staying will cost you pieces of yourself you can't afford to lose. I finally said something, and it changed nothing. Nothing except me. After I realized nothing had changed, life didn't suddenly fall apart. That surprised me. There was no dramatic ending, no final conversation, no moment where everything became clear all at once. We kept living the same days. We woke up. We talked about practical things. We shared space. We existed side by side. From the outside, it probably looked exactly the same. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't confused anymore. Before, I used to wake up hoping today would feel different, hoping they would notice something without being told, hoping effort would appear quietly on its own. After that realization, I stopped waking up with hope, and strangely, that made things clearer. I noticed how predictable the silence had become, how consistent the distance was. It wasn't random. It wasn't temporary. It was the relationship as it truly was. There were moments when they spoke to me, and I answered politely, carefully, not because I was angry, but because I no longer felt the need to offer more than was being met. I stopped filling the empty spaces with my energy. Before, if a conversation slowed down, I would rush to save it. Ask another question, share another thought, carry the emotional weight forward. Now, I let the silence sit where it landed, and I noticed something. They didn't step into it. That was when I understood that silence, when you stop fighting it, tells the truth very clearly. I became aware of how often I had been compensating, how much emotional work I had been doing quietly without anyone asking me to. I had mistaken effort for love. and endurance for commitment. After saying something and seeing nothing change, I didn't feel the need to prove my pain anymore. I didn't replay conversations as often. I didn't rehearse new ways of explaining myself. There was nothing left to translate. The truth was already simple. They knew how I felt. They knew what I needed. And still, they chose the same distance. That choice spoke louder than anything they could have said. There were moments when they laughed, and I realized I was watching instead of joining. Not because I didn't care, but because some part of me had stepped back to protect itself. I had learned that closeness without care creates a deeper loneliness than being alone. I started noticing myself again. How quiet I became when I felt unseen. How tense my body was when I expected disappointment. How relieved I felt during moments of emotional distance when I didn't have to hope for more. That relief scared me, because it meant I was adapting too well to something that was hurting me. I wasn't numb. I was aware. And awareness changes everything. I stopped asking questions I already knew the answer to. I stopped reaching for reassurance that never came naturally. I stopped pretending that patience would eventually turn into connection. Not because I was giving up, but because I was finally being honest with myself. There is a particular kind of sadness that comes after clarity. It's not loud. It doesn't beg. It simply sits with you. It shows you the truth of where you are, without offering an easy escape. I didn't hate them. I didn't blame them. I understood that this was the best they could offer, and I understood, just as clearly, that it wasn't enough for me. That understanding didn't lead to an immediate decision. It led to stillness. A stillness where I no longer disappeared to keep things calm. A stillness where I stopped shrinking my needs to fit the space available. I began to notice what it felt like to stay connected to myself, even when the relationship didn't offer that connection back. That was new, and quiet, and powerful. I learned that love shouldn't require you to become smaller to keep it intact. That wanting presence isn't asking for too much, and that being alone inside a relationship is a kind of warning you shouldn't ignore. I didn't suddenly know what I would do next, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never again confuse silence with peace. I would never again believe that being understood was enough. Because understanding without care changes nothing, and now neither do I.